Thank you for listening to this episode.
And follow the podcast on social media by finding at @Prestigious_pod. And if you'd like to be coached on how to live a more prestigious life, you can reach out to me, Chris Bean, at ChrisBeanOfficial, or by emailing the podcast directly at prestigiousInitiative@gmail.com.
Lastly, sign up for our newsletter either through social media or on our website.
This is the Prestigious Initiative. Welcome. I'm Chris Bean. Today we're diving into the world of America's greatest literary figures, Mark Twain. I'm joined by my good friend Warren Brown, a man who has dedicated his life to studying and impersonating Mark Twain, bringing his wit, his wisdom, and life experiences back to audiences across the country. Warren, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be on your show.
Warren, let's start with kind of what brought you here today. Tell us a little bit about you.
Well, I like to start at the very beginning, and that would be that I was born September the 6th, and I'll bypass the year, but you can guess that it's been a long time ago. So my son Gregory is a participant in your martial arts studio with a special recreation, and we've spoken on several occasions and discussed many events of the world and the exciting things that you are up to and what I am up to, as well as what my child is up to and the rest of the group. So that's how we kind of connected and got together. I've been doing Mark Twain for 27 years.
Wow.
So, and it was, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, okay, so let's talk about that. So Warren, what first drew you to Mark Twain? Was there a specific moment or experience that kind of, put you onto that path and really help you to bring him back to life for so many people?
Well, one of the things that I was engaged in life was working in industry, and I was very successful in industry, and then suddenly industry started to disappear in the country, and for 17 years, I found it quite difficult to find a job that fit my occupation and quality of styles, the things that I was into. I was into materials management, inventory control, a very extensive manufacturing operation. And I thought, well, I'm going to create something to do. And that was back in 1996. I decided I would like to go into schools and excite kids about education, literacy, and special needs were the things that I was interested in at the time. And I was a challenged student, and I thought if I can be successful, so can everyone else if they're encouraged properly. So I had seen Mark Twain presented by Hal Holbrook when I was about 7 or 8 years of age at a PTA program in my school. And I really didn't understand the entire production or any of the level of the humor or anything else, but it inspired me. And of course, it was related to school. And that was the best part of school that I liked, was the fun part of school. So I thought, well, I can study this and I could do the same thing. I could present information and encourage kids in school.
Okay, so why Mark Twain? Did somebody say, "Hey, you look like Mark Twain," or how did that come about? Because you could, really, you could do that with any literary person across history. Why Mark Twain?
Exactly. Well, I like to think that I had maybe 5 people in history that impressed me that I could bring to an audience, and of the people that I had selected, I had Walt Disney, which was a very different kind of presentation or information. Will Rogers was another one that I enjoyed, his style, his humor, the way he executed his information. Benjamin Franklin was another person in history that I liked his initiative and the things that he did that I thought were very unique, as well as Mark Twain. And as I got started in my program, I realized how complicated the whole task was going to be. And I had to break it down into component parts. And I spent 3 months just working on international copyright law because I didn't want to infringe upon anything that was not in the public domain. So by the time I started collecting and memorizing was never anything that I did well. I always tell people that I was struggling to do the Lord's Prayer and the Pledge of Allegiance. I knew the history of the word lip sing before it became a popular word because I thought, we were doing something for Richard Stanza instead of the flag for which it stands. So I tried to confine the focus of my energy to memorizing scripts and developing techniques that I could memorize an hour and a half of material that I had selected. And it was going to be in two parts, a young Mark Twain and an older Mark Twain with an intermission. So another 3 months was dedicated to just that. And when I presented my initial program, it was from start to finish, very rote, specific, word for word, exactly as I had memorized it. That was an accomplishment for me in its own right. If I never did any more, I at least could say that I had done that much. And I knew that my teachers would say it's not possible.
So, all right, now, do we have any? I think I know the answer to this, but I'll ask anyways. Do we have any footage of Mark Twain speaking or presenting anything?
Well, that's a great question, and I like to answer it because it's kind of interesting. There's about 20 seconds of film footage without any speaking. And that was at his home, and he's out on his patio and he's wearing his white suit traditionally, which he wore at home. He did wear it one time to go to a special session of Congress to talk about international copyright law, and he met with them at the Library of Congress. So that was a unique appearance. You would never wear a white suit out in public, and especially at the time of year that he was there. And he said, well, at his age, he was allowed to do what he wanted. And of course, there were 5 wax cylinders that were designed and invented by Thomas Edison that they had actual recordings of his voice. And 3 of them were lost in the fire, the New Jersey fire at the Edison laboratory. And 2 of them were available. They didn't know the whereabouts of one of them. Another one was at the university at Yale, and it was available for personal review on site with an inquest. You would say, I would like to do this. I'm doing research. Can I hear this? And I knew several people that tried to do that, and nobody could ever produce the wax cylinder. So I like to say that it goes by the Twain quote, it's better to take what does not belong to you than to leave it lying around neglected.
Okay. So, as you are becoming Mark Twain, what type of things do you do to put yourself into his shoes? And on top of that, because you have that 20 seconds of non-speaking footage, and there's a mysterious audio that they say exists that nobody's really ever heard. How do you build that character?
There are many written documents, newspaper reports of his actual presentation. And I like to tell people that when he was at home, that he talked pretty normally, just like everybody else, without an accent and at relatively regular speeds. When he was on stage, he acted like it was very casual, impromptu, that he was thinking about something rather than the fact that he had spent 2 or 3 weeks memorizing a particular piece that he was going to deliver or working on several items that he was going to present on stage. They were memorized, but he tried to make it look like it was impromptu and it was just casual and off the cuff. So I like to try and think that I have kind of fallen into that same category, that it's just random, it's not in any particular sequence. And when I first started, I would put makeup in my hair, the whitener, to make it look like what most people today in America would know Mark Twain as the elder Mark Twain, because there was a whole magazine release of 7 or 8 photos on the Saturday Evening Post that went across the United States and probably around the world. This is what Mark Twain looked like. Now, there were many drawings and people that had drawn pictures that appeared on different magazines, but they took a lot of liberties in the way they presented the drawings to accentuate whatever he was presenting, including the presentation as a cowboy. So you wouldn't think of him as a cowboy for sure, but that was part of his early influence in his presentations and lectures that he would give in his early writings.
All right. Mark Twain is known for his sharp wit, social commentary. How do you think his views on humor would resonate with modern audiences, especially, as you're speaking to a lot of the youth, the younger kids in school? How do you think that would go as far as his wit and his social commentary?
Well, I definitely have given that a lot of thought. And Clement's definition of humor was, because everyone always asked him about humor, and he said that humor was nothing more than contrast. The greater the contrast, the greater the humor. And if you thought of just a blank wall and it had a little tiny spot of red or black or green or whatever color on it, and it didn't belong there, you would say, well, why is that spot there? And he might say, it's intentional, because I find it humorous that it is there. It doesn't belong there, but it is. But his wit was very sharp, very quick. He had the ability to call from our great language of English and many other languages that he studied words that sometimes made a lot of sense and sometimes they didn't. And that's kind of a challenging thing. He said the most valuable thing was his dictionary. He said he reads it often, but he hasn't quite figured out the plot yet.
Very good.
And he spent, I'm going to tell you, from the age of 12 to 17, almost 6 years as a printer's double setting type for the newspaper. So he learned that trade of setting type and words. He was very good at doing so. It was a trade profession that, just like Benjamin Franklin would have been engaged in, setting type, gathering the news, printing the news, and then reporting it. And he often told the news, but would use what he called a stretcher, and that would be to exaggerate the truth. And he was well known for doing that, which led him to lots of reasons why he frequently changed his name.
Okay. So one of the questions that, of course, is his name is not Mark Twain, although lots of people I don't think know that anymore. His name's not Mark Twain. That's a surname that he used for writing. What was the purpose for recreating himself? And I guess on top of that, when he did that, did he also create a persona that was Mark Twain, and he had his own persona that was Sam Clemens? Were they separate, or was it just the name difference?
I'll answer the second part of the question first, because it's fresh in my memory. The truth is, he did create the name Mark Twain, and he actually patented it or had a copyright on it. So there is now a foundation that regulates all of the Mark Twain paraphernalia. So if there's a patent on it would have to go through that for approval, how it's going to be utilized. Is it in the public domain, or is this something strictly that would go into the Mark Twain Foundation, and that's managed by a company. I think it's called something like Curtis CMG, Curtis, and all the rights to people living and dead are regulated through them, so that if there are royalties that have to be paid, they would be collected and then directed appropriately within the foundation rules. So that's kind of an interesting part, but I would say initially, however people related to him, he would respond. So many personal letters he would address Mark or Sam. It wasn't really one or the other. So they kind of became nicknames. And his wife's nickname for him was Youth. And I say because he was always acting like a child, and she was his foundation and made certain that he went out the door looking appropriately, behaving appropriately. He was pretty childish in many respects, and that is, I think, one of the things that gravitates or attracts to young people as well as to older people. I like the way that he relates to that and writes about that. He said this book is intended for a more mature audience, but it is hoped that it will relate to things that people will remember when they were younger. And one of his quotes was about age. He said, better to have been born at the age of 81 and gradually work our way back to 18. And of course, they've used that in movie theories and strategies since then. And I don't know that he said it originally, but he also said things of, because he talked about his quotes all the time, we're not sure that anybody said anything originally before Adam. And we're not too sure about that.
All right. So quotes is something that I'm relatively passionate about, I would say. You know that.
Yeah.
He has Mark Twain has a heaping load of quotes that are attributed to him.
Yes.
But they are not factual things that he probably ever said. One, why do you think that is? And then two, as somebody in your field, how do you contend with that?
Well, great question. But did you want me to answer the pen name
Oh
thing
yeah,
quick?
absolutely. Yes, let's do that
Quickly,
first.
just go backwards for a second. Um, there was a reason I wanted to do that secondly rather than first. The pen names, his first pen name was Josh, and later he used several different names. And somebody asked his mother how it is that any time her son said something to her that she could believe him. And she said it was like fetching a pail of water from the well. When you got the water up from the well, you would pitch out 95% of what was in the bucket, and what was left was 5% of pure truth. So if you dismiss 95% of it, there is a nugget of truth in there, but it's challenging to get it. So when you're writing, when people know that I was the author of whatever was written, and it said Samuel Clemens, they might throw it out or not even read it. You know, the headline is such that it's attractive, but by Samuel Clemens, well, we know that most of it's not true. I'm not going to read it. If it's fascinating and it's exciting, you put a different name on there. So Josh was originally kind of intended as it applies to kid somebody. And so he tried to make the story such that there were things in there that could not be true, but you didn't always pick up on that. And he liked to tell things, and if it was accepted, all the better. So later, he now is writing on the riverboat using the name Thomas Jefferson Snodgrass as a pseudonym or a pen name. And there was another man on the boat, also a river pilot, using the pen name Mark Twain, which is a river term which means 2 fathoms or 12 feet It was the depth of the water when the boat was going away from shore. 12 feet was where it was deep enough and safe sailing. And coming into shore, it was shallow water and dangerous sailing. So the other fellow was using the name, and he was one of the oldest men on the Mississippi River. And Clemens said he wrote a piece under Thomas Jefferson Snodgrass, poking fun at the other man, Captain Sellers, and he took it the wrong way and he quit the river. Well, that wasn't Clemens' intention, but that's what happened. So later, now when he's off of the river and he was out in the Nevada Territory, he was looking for another handle to use and read where Captain Sellers had passed away, and he decided to use the name Mark Twain in his honor. And he really liked the term, and I use it for being, he used the pseudonym Sergeant Fathom. When you fathom something, you take it to its core meaning. It's doubly so. And he liked doing things with twins and doubles, and it kind of complicates the storyline. And so now he's going to use the name Mark Twain. He steals it and uses it for a publication. And that was for the Calaveras Jumping Frog. And that actually got published under a different name because it was a mistake by the person that was printing it. And it was published using the last name Swain, Swain, which was not correct. So everyone knew that he had written it, but it wasn't attributed properly to Mark Twain. And he said, besides that, it was a lot easier to spell than Thomas Jefferson Snodgrass.
So he was kind of the first boy who cried wolf, and he figured his way out of that by just changing his name so that that would be something that was understandable, or something that the people that he was writing for would actually read, because otherwise they wouldn't believe whatever story he had to tell.
Well, there were many writers at that time who were using pen names. That was quite common, rather than attribute your name if they didn't like the way that it looked in print, or if it had some hidden meaning, they preferred using that pen name. It was fairly common, and it was especially so in his case because he had this reputation for telling non-truths.
Very
or lies.
interesting. So
Now, coming back to your quotes, do you want to pick up on that, or
yes.
As a child, everyone was pushing Benjamin Franklin quotes in the schools and in their families because he had a characteristic or personality that said he's a wonderful man, he's very accomplished, one of the great founders of our country at every turn. And he was constantly publishing all of these morals, values, one-liners about the Farmer's Almanac. Of course, they still publish today. And we want you to, and the one that I like to use that Clemens talked about was early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. That was a Benjamin Franklin that would have been shoved down his throat. And he didn't especially like to have to do certain things. So he goes on later to say that if I live long enough, I hope that I have more quotes and things to say than Benjamin Franklin. Now, I believe that he's accomplished that. But I do know that the early speakers and people who were public figures would get monthly booklets that were published, and they would have many different quotes and things that could be used. I know Abraham Lincoln used them, and he was certainly using a lot of those quotes before Sam Clemens was on the circuit. And that would have probably been around 1870 or a little bit earlier. So Lincoln was already gone, but people in Lincoln's time would have had those same quotes, and sometimes somebody will say, was that Lincoln or is that Mark Twain? And well, some of it was based on actual verbiage or truths that were in the Bible. Wisdom certainly is talked about in the Bible. And Mark Twain said regarding Franklin's quote that in his case, he thought it was sound advice. Early to bed, early to rise. And he said, I like getting up in the morning with the birds. And a well-trained lark won't get up until 10 or 11. So there's silliness involved in the clever response. And Mark or Sam, and I think later in his life, he probably was as conflicted whether it was his writing or his personal. I think they kind of blended and became one and the same. I find after 27 years that my mind thinks the same way. Sometimes I don't know if I'm saying something originally or if it's something I've read about Clemens and something I've presented. I like his persona. I like the things that he wrote. So, and again, I'm just kind of getting mixed in my thinking process here. So you can jump in any moment and refocus if I get off point.
Yeah, so with having so many quotes, and he a lot of times he gets attributed to saying a lot of things that he didn't actually say.
Correct.
How do you contend with something like that in being in your profession?
If I'm not familiar with the quote, I like to go in and do a little research, and they're quite popular to use. I actually wrote a letter to one of the newspapers that I subscribe to, and they were using several Mark Twain quotes periodically based on the writers that submit information. And I wrote back and I said the quote that was used, I know was not a Mark Twain quote. And I recommended that if you want to validate the quote, you can go to twainquotes.com, which was put together by Barb Schmidt. She was a professor of English at Tarleton University, and there are two or three other professors of English and literature and some other fields that have done papers on Mark Twain. They submit information. Barb Schmidt's site, you can look up a categorical topic on with a search feature on almost anything, and most of them are illustrated. They have original Mark Twain related advertising and pictures. The fellow that attributed or collected a lot of that was a fellow by the name of Dave Thompson. So it's a beautiful site to use. So there are places where they have attributed quotes, but not proven quotes. So you could actually go and search and look for something yet to be discovered or found, because everything prior to 1923 is in public domain. So a lot of that information in his writings is available to read. But sometimes there are things in his speeches that might be buried, and a lot of the speeches are actually transcribed and available for searching as well. But the discovery of some of these quotes is yet to be. I know that they have boxes of manuals, scripts, and papers that Mark Twain wrote that are at the Bancroft Library out in California. That's where they keep all those documents, and they actually have a Mark Twain research that takes place at the library there. So they're responsible for what has yet to be published. His 3-volume set autobiography was completed when he died, clearly, in 1910. His biographer, Albert Bigelow Paine, was responsible for gathering and collecting all the information that they had been working on for 4 years of dictation and transcribing and writing. He requested that information on that autobiography not be published until he had been dead for 100 years. And I like to tell people that's the first time that a publisher ever did what was requested of them. Over that time, and the first volume came out in 2010. But about a third, is my guess, of the total content was distributed in other people's books with permission prior to that period of time under other titles by other uh, authors. So it's very interesting. But I think that some quotes are yet to be discovered in some of his writings, and I always like to look in the various books that I read to see if some nugget still is there to be revealed. But most everything prior to 23 is available to public search.
Well, and I would imagine with the upbringing that he had, so being a typesetter, being a journalist, being an author, as proficient as he was, being somebody that wrote and spoke to so many different people, I would have to imagine that he learned the rules, which like speaking on making up words that I something I know that he has done from speaking to you previously, but he learned the rules, he practiced the rules, and then after doing both of those two things, then he learned how to break the rules for specific instances and to gain whatever reason that he had to break those. He did it on purpose. And I again, I know from speaking to you in the past that a lot of times he would write, whatever the book or the whatever he was writing, the person that was going through the proofreading it or anything like that, nothing needed to be changed because he got it right the first time because he had such the time. He put the time in, right? He knew how to write. He knew how to read. He put the practice in of typesetting the letters, working at the paper, and then was a journalist. He had all of that time, and so being somebody, hearing that he wanted to have more quotes than Benjamin Franklin, but he put himself in the right positions strategically. I think maybe purposefully, but maybe not so much as well. But he certainly did those things, and he, I think, achieved that because I think you can take a random selection of people, and they could probably tell you more things that were attributed to Mark Twain than were Benjamin Franklin. Not to say either about the other, but Mark Twain has a sheer number of quotes that are directly attributed to him that is fascinating.
Yes. Later in his career in life, he made a statement, and I was reading through something the other day, kind of looking for information I might share with you on this podcast. Um, One of the fellows wrote that during his early life, Clemens said that he wanted to make people laugh when he was first getting started. And as he got older, he said, I really no longer want to make people laugh. He said, I want to tell people the truth. I want them to know and understand the things that we're dealing with and engaged in, and that we can do a better job. So he called those maxims. Other people may have called it that as well, but he referred to it as a maximum of wisdom and a minimum of breadth. So it would typically be a one-liner. And one of the reasons I think that it's very workable today is our humor level is generally, I call it a three-minute soundbite. We have the setup, the build line, and then we deliver, and then bam, we hit you with the punchline. Well, he tried to do that all in one sentence. And that's what made it challenging. He used to keep daily notebooks, and some of his best one-liners are in those notebooks, which did not get published until later in life. So they can be used, of course, but you can't profit from them because you can't put it on a T-shirt and try to sell them, even if you had original artwork, because that is something that is regulated by the Mark Twain Foundation. And I applaud that. Mark Twain was talking about, because of that meeting they had in Washington, D.C., they talked about copyright law because they were publishing his books in other countries around the world before he had them on the market. So it was 1972, 62 years, almost 65 years from the time he had that conversation in Washington, D.C., before they came out with international copyright restrictions. So I think that's kind of exciting. And we changed the amount of time that period was in copyright law because of Walt Disney, and Mickey Mouse was coming into public domain, and they extended the life of copyright law 17 years to address that. Well, I think that 17 years has expired. I didn't follow whether or not they extended the law or not, but the reason we
Actually,
changed it.
I know a little bit about this. I think it was early last year where Mickey Mouse was now is in the public domain, and so it's interesting that you say that. So
Yeah,
I think it was early last year. I could be wrong on the date, but I know that
right.
he is Mickey Mouse is in the public domain now, which is kind of wild to think about. But the time is up on it. It expired.
Yeah. And of course, it's got my approval on both fronts because Walt Disney was one of the guys that I thought was pretty exciting when I first decided I had people who influenced my life that made life exciting and interesting. And I like the sarcasm that Clemens uses, especially in books like The Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court. He uses a lot of satire and irony on, here are the atrocities that are happening. And the artwork that was included in there by Dan Beard, one of his illustrators, addresses it significantly. So there were illustrations in all of his original works, and that was something that was time appropriate for almost all authors. They would have had an illustrator for the first page of each chapter. And when you get reproductions, they don't have those pictures. And I think they're a significant part of the storyline, especially for people who might not read well. They get the essence of what's at each picture for what's to follow in the chapter.
Well, okay, so that is an interesting thing because I know I know you are a fan of Jordan Peterson, and I know that for Jordan's I guess second book, 12 More Rules for Life, he met with an artist, and they strategically designed the artwork that went for each of those rules to match what was going on. And I'm sure they went through a few iterations, but we don't, especially now I read almost standardly works of nonfiction, and
Yes,
very little to no pictures at all across anywhere. Jordan, really being the standout that is different there because he has that. And the other thing, part of that is interesting is that image. If you really, so if you read through the chapter, the rule, whatever it is, then you call back to that image, you can see what is happening in that image based on what is going on in that rule, and they're connected there. Now you maybe couldn't do that. I couldn't do that off the cuff just looking at that image, but then after reading that, I can attribute the things that are happening in that image with the things that he's doing in the text of that.
yes,
So that is interesting that even though that's sort of lost to time, we do still have at least a handful of authors. Again, Jordan Peterson being the at least for my prime example here, being the person that
right.
does that, and he has an artist that he worked with to create those images to specifically detail what was going on in those chapters.
There's a reinforcement of the image to the written narrative, and my initial scripts, I used a caricature or a drawn image for every word in my script. And I said I could memorize those pictures vividly, whereas I could not visually memorize the words. If I listen to the words, I can remember and recall the words. But if I'm running it through my mind, I would go through my picture images, not the sound that was recorded in my hearing.
Okay, so
So
that is really
initially,
interesting. I'm gonna kind of
yeah,
underline that a little bit. So we had, at this point, it's been a while ago. Listeners, you can go back and listen to the interview that we had with Ashton Rodenizer. She was a sketch noter, and so sketchnoting is essentially what you're talking about right
yes,
now. Is
yeah,
instead of writing word for word and notes and notes in words, you're drawing images, and those images are representations of whatever the thing is. And the wonderful thing about that is I can, I have a sheet of notes here. I'm
yeah,
making doodles and words and stuff, but as I am writing using the sketchnoting type of technique, I can build in like 4, 5, 8, 10 pages worth of line for line written notes that
yes,
really would be encompassed inside of one image that can be contained on one page. And that is, again, that's a snapshot. You can mentally, you may not remember every word that you're writing or every
correct,
word that is written down, but as you're taking those notes, if you're drawing little doodles, which teachers are trying to shove out of you, really that is probably the best way to take notes, because then you can remember those images, and that image is significant to have whatever the meaning of the word actually is. So that's really interesting that you were doing that, as opposed to writing word for word and then memorizing word for word. You're memorizing the images that
right.
were there.
So now going back to what I told you about Mark Twain saying that it takes almost 3 weeks to memorize an impromptu quote. And he did spend 3 weeks putting it together, but his story may have been about the smoking routine. And his lecture notes for the evening may include a picture of a cigar to remind him to talk about that little anecdotal story about smoking. And he may have a picture of a watermelon to remind him of the stolen watermelon and how he was using that for changing his moral values. And there would be another one with a palm tree, a picture, and that was to remind him to talk about Hawaii. So he memorized each of those individual anecdotal stories or things that he had written or had told, things that were shared around the campfire. He would tell those stories, but he had a trigger on his evening notes. Be sure to, and I use that frequently with just some pictures on my little 3x5 card. And sometimes I have key phrases rather than the entire story. And I can select any one of a dozen different stories at any given time. You don't have to be specific. And he said, reading from, and he did a lot of readings from various other authors on stage, people that he really liked. He said, when you are reading, you are essentially just a mimic. Whereas when you use your own words to express what the words of the author is that you're reading, you have become the author themselves. And that's what I want to try and present to people when I'm presenting, that they come away from the program knowing that they personally were engaged with Mark Twain, not with Warren Brown. And you could have no greater compliment than that you want to go immediately to your library and pick up a book and read something. I didn't know that. There's so many interesting factual pieces of information about the man and the thousands of people that he knew, influential people around the world. He was an ambassador to America, the traveling, despite the fact that he often criticized our political system, the political systems of other countries. He was just and upright, and he was a cause for our poor souls, those that were disadvantaged, those that were taken advantage of. He was standing behind them all the time. People were upset when he exposed the atrocities that took place by our government and other governments around the world. They actually prevented him from publishing certain information, saying that we will make sure that you never publish again if you let this go to press. The United States government. So he was a principled person about American freedom and democracy. He didn't believe that we had to force it down anybody's throat. He was a member of the anti-imperialist party from 1900 to 1910. He was a regional vice president of that when roughly a third of the country were in that alignment of anti-imperialists. They weren't Republicans or Democrats. They were anti-imperialists. When women were being discussed about having the right to vote, he said, initially, I was not in favor of women having the right to vote. And then something changed and he supported it. And somebody said, what made it change? I said, he got married. He realized that women had higher moral values and ethical standards than most men. And when women got the right to vote, they would eliminate all the crime and corruption in politics. I like talking about that.
Yeah, I did not know, I guess, where he stood politically, but it sounds like he was, and I guess he's bumping shoulders with a lot of historical figures that are, awfully influential, as you said, and
Yeah.
many of them at that. And so I guess it should be obvious of how much of the game he was playing.
Yeah, and he had one of those maxims that he talked about on voting. He said, an honest person will be honest 365 days a year or 364 days a year, except for 2 days. And then they won't be honest. And that one day is tax filing day and the other day is election day. You want to vote for the best candidate, not your party.
Yes. Yes. Now, all right, let's talk about your process of learning to embody Mark Twain. Are there habits or any daily routines of his that you have adopted to help to stay in character, or that you use to continually improve your portrayal?
Well, the one thing I would like to adopt is sleeping till 11 o'clock, but that's not the case. And he would go out to his study when he was on vacation, and he would write 80 pages a day from the time that he finished having breakfast until probably the late afternoon. And he was uh, he was a prolific writer. So for him to be able to write that much, and as you mentioned earlier, most of it was such that it didn't need any editing. When he was responding to something that he read in a newspaper and he was really angry, he would write immediately a response to that to send back to the publisher. And he often said that I would let it sit on the table for 2 or 3 days and I would come back and I would read it again and I would take some of the steam out of it. Because he knew that if he was angry about it, they wouldn't read it or take his advice. And so he came back in 3 more days and he would do the same thing. He said at the end of a week, all the steam was gone. I no longer wanted to send it.
Which is a great practice that I think people could adopt even today.
For certain. Yes. But he would frequently write to his friends and leave the steam in the letters because his friends could send back constructive criticism or say, we're in agreement and you should send this exactly as it is without any editing. And his wife would do the same thing with him in the house. So she kept him grounded.
Okay, so with him being a writer, I know from knowing you that your mission, your goal by portraying him and speaking to the youth and all the people that you speak to is to increase their love of learning, increase their love of reading, of literature.
Yes.
But let's go a step further than that. Because Mark Twain was such a prolific writer, what would be some takeaways that somebody, if they wanted to be a writer, what are some takeaways that they could gain from Mark Twain? Like you talked about him writing 80 pages a day. So having a daily limit, writing every day, having a daily limit or thereabouts that you're holding yourself to, I think would be a good starting place. But what other insights could we gain if somebody wanted to be a writer?
Well, one of the things that he often talked about was, and they don't have inkwells anymore on the desk. So the illustration has to be kind of imagined a little bit, but you would fill the ink into your pen to write. And he said he would have multiple projects going on simultaneously. So he would write as long as his imagination held out on a particular topic, things that he had been thinking about. And he would write on that subject until the inkwell had run dry, which meant that his thoughts about that subject had gone blank. And a lot of writers, when they get to a writing block, stop writing. They don't, I can't think anymore where I want to take that story. But he would have another project that might be going on, and he would write on that project for as long as his inkwell was full on that project. And when it went dry, he would move to the next. And he would make 5 or 6 projects going simultaneously. So when he got back to the last project that ran dry, he said, miraculously, without anything that I had done, the inkwell on my first project had been filled again. So subconsciously, your brain is always thinking about these activities, but you're not deliberately coming back to that right away. Go around, and if it was 3 or 4 projects, what difference does it make? But miraculously now, I have a lot that I want to say about that first project, and I'm going to continue writing there. When he wrote Huckleberry Finn, and this is a very good example of one, he wrote 16 chapters in practically one setting or session of settings initially, all at one time. And at the end of the 16th chapter, he didn't know what he was going to do with Jim and Huck at the bottom of the state of Illinois on the Mississippi River. Were they going to go up the Ohio River into freedom, or were they going to go south back into slavery? He didn't know how he was going to handle that. And it was almost 7 or 8 years that passed, and he was working on Grant's memoirs, publishing those for Grant. And he was reading the galley sheets, and suddenly now he's revisiting all the important elements of that whole issue of race. That book is about racism and ending it in the United States as we know it. At the time that he was writing that in 1884, 85, that wouldn't have been an acceptable thing to publish, except for the fact that it was presented from the point of view from a boy's perspective. And Jim was that boy's mentor. That was Huck's mentor. So now suddenly he understands they have to go south into slave country in order to continue the story. And he sits down and he finishes the writing of the balance of those chapters for that book.
That's book, amazing. That's amazing.
It is amazing.
Wow.
That's a great story in its own right.
Yeah. And again, as we're talking, I know that most of his writing was ready to print as soon as it was on the page. And so to write Correct. 16 chapters in one sitting, essentially, that's wow. Wow.
Even if it was several days, yes.
Sure, yeah. Sure. If it was a month, wow. and to know that he was writing it, and because of his background, because he knew the rules, he knew how to play the game, and he knew the creative and specific reasons if and when to break the rules, for what reason, that he put a word on a page, it was ready to go to print that day. That
Yeah,
that is
and
amazing.
it's interesting that you mentioned that because essentially the two-volume set book that Grant put together was done almost identically
Hmm.
and didn't require all the editing and that you would think had to go into it. He was capable of writing clear letters of English sentences that you could follow. His field command in writing letters is reflected in the writing of his book. And it was a two-volume book. They printed it in a two-volume set. And the first, he was dying of throat cancer. It was very serious, and they weren't sure that he had enough strength and energy to complete the mission. And he finished the second volume 4 days before he passed, or five maybe. And it was the first volume was published that December after he died, and the second one was made available after it was completed in the publishing. Just a remarkable talent by two writers that were capable of, and there were probably others who were the same, that had that experience of writing without having to do all the editing and adjustments. I'm not happy with something I write if it's 25 times that I've redone it. I noticed something I missed 6 years ago on something I wrote. I think that I'm doing a good job, but you'd have to have other people proof it to make sure that it's done correctly.
Okay, so we're going to change gears a little bit. We talked
Yes,
about
sir.
Mark Twain being a humorist, but really, in all accounts, he was also a philosopher. What are
He
some
wanted to be remembered as a social uh, uh,
philosopher?
no, I want to say that he was engaged in social reform,
Hmm.
not so much as a philosopher. He wanted to change the way things were. He wanted to change the way people voted. He wanted to change the treatment of the common man. He was in favor of unions. He was in favor of freedom of other countries. He was against colonization. He was not a hawk. He was not in favor of war. He said the best thing that Grant had done in the Civil War, and they were personally good friends, he said, was not that he won the war, it was that he ended the war. That was his greatest accomplishment, that he ended the war. We can overlook an awful lot of issues if the outcome is peace. So I would say that, that was something that definitely was about social change. Uh, Race against cultural races against the different people, uh, whatever their religions were, whatever their race was. He was about bringing people together. He was in favor of being the common man, not the person at the top of the rock. He was interested in being on the ground with people.
All right. So
And
so
he had a
Warren,
life motto I'll read later.
what's that?
He had a life motto that I'll read later
Okay.
in this.
Yeah. So
But go ahead with your question.
yeah, I was just gonna say. So with him being, um, I'll use again the term philosophizer or a philosopher. What what
Reformer was the word I was looking
reformer?
for.
Okay, so with him being a reformer of that type, what lessons did he leave us with that are most relevant or inspiring?
But one I use for the close of my program, and I'll just read that. It's only a few lines. It says, "What is the most rigorous law of our being? Growth. No smallest atom of our moral, mental, or physical structure can stand still a year. In other words, we change and must change constantly and keep on changing as long as we live." What then is the true gospel of consistency? Change. And that's from one of his speeches at a literary program in London, 1900.
Wow.
And he knew that he needed to change and keep changing. And I often will tell people that he said, I formed my habits one stair at a time. And I went up each stair progressively my entire life. And now that I'm at the pinnacle of my success at my age, I find it nearly impossible to come down even one. But I know that I must continue to change and keep changing. And a lot of people will talk about the difference of Mark Twain being kind of an old crotchety curmudgeon, and some of the works that they've taken from him and put together are kind of a dark side of Mark Twain, and say, well, when you late in life, you were writing kind of a dark approach on things. And I'll tell people, no, he was writing that way from the very beginning. And his wife wouldn't let him publish some of that stuff. One of the books that he was writing, he had been writing for 37 years. And he didn't publish it until his wife was deceased. And he now had the freedom to do that. And he didn't want things to reflect negatively back on his family, on things that he might reveal about somebody that didn't take it favorably. So that's why he put that clause on that his autobiography not be published for 100 years. He said, only from the grave can you tell the truth. Once you're dead, it's okay.
Yeah, and then he did it.
Yeah.
So, all right. So, Warren, as we're wrapping up here, what advice would Mark Twain, through you, give to our listeners to have a impact or meaningful little nugget for them?
Well, I'm going to tell you that although he didn't have a lot of schooling, he had 5 honorary degrees. And his advice would be to stay in school, to learn as much as you can, be excited about the field that you're in. Don't let anybody talk you out of it. And if you need to go work for somebody for free to be employed in a company that is somewhere that you want to be, after 2 weeks of working for free, they won't let you work for free. They'll pay you. They want you to stay there because you show that you are a valued employee and you have a work ethic. You're exciting. You're interested in what you're doing. You want to learn. And so stay in school. And if you drop out of school, do everything you can to be in the field that you want to be in and learn all that you can in that area, and you will succeed. Don't ever give up on that. He said on New Year's one year, I'm going to be successful next year, even if I have to borrow money to do it.
So and the last thing you mentioned, his life motto. You were going to share that.
Oh yeah, it's if I can find it, there was it's on my desk, right in front of me. This was written in a book. How to take life. Take it just as though it was, as it is, an earnest, vital, and important affair. Take it as though you were born to the task of performing a merry part in it, as though the world had awaited for your coming. Take it as though it was a grand opportunity to do and achieve, to carry forward great and good schemes, to help and cheer a suffering, weary, it may be broken brother. Now and then a man stands aside from the crowd, labors earnestly, steadfastly, confidently, and straightway becomes famous for wisdom, intellect, skill, greatness of some sort. The world wonders, admires, idolizes, and it only illustrates what others may do if they take hold of life with a purpose. The miracle or the power that elevates the few is to be found in their industry, application, and perseverance under the promptings of a brave, determined spirit. That's got everybody's name on it.
Absolutely. Very profound. Now, Warren, if our listeners want to learn more about you or to get in touch with you, where could they go to do that?
Well, I have a website, and it's Catch the Twain, all one word, .com. And I have a lot of information there, but I'll also send you a couple of links, and that'll have my program, and people can see how my program works. It's about 38 minutes. There will be a link to the Humanities Council in Nebraska. They like having me come there. I've been doing that for a number of years. So it's an honor to be there. And it was a good event, and it would illustrate. Also on YouTube, I have 3 clips. If you put in Catch the Twain, Warren Brown, they'll pop up.
Wonderful. And I'll be sure to leave those links in the show notes below. I hope you've been as inspired as I have been by Warren's journey and Mark Twain's timeless wisdom. If you want to learn more about Warren's work or even catch one of the performances, be sure to check out the links in the show notes. Thanks again for joining us, Warren. And remember, make every day count.